This is my dad, my stepmom, and my dog, because my little sister went to bed. Having a hobby can boost self-esteem, passion, creativity, as well as reduce stress and depression. My favorite hobby would be comic book collecting. It's not only fun, but it can be profitable. I've done a lot of research on comic book collecting, and I've been collecting for a while now. Today I'm going to talk about the overview of the history of comic books, things to know about comic book collecting, and how to price comic books. First, I'm going to go over the history of comic books. First, let's start with important people. From the beginning, Rudolf Topfer, he is said to write the first graphic novel in 1827. Richard Outcourt wrote the first comic strip in 1895. Brenda Starr was the first woman to write a comic book in 1940. Each of these important people fall into their own comic book era. In an interview with Mark Zaid, there are 7 different eras. First, starting with the Victorian Age in the late 18th century, moving on to the Platinum Age in the late 19th century. This is when comics started to develop as to what we know them today. World War II started the Golden Age. This was arguably the most important era because it started the Action Comics and Superman. The Atom Age was about 15 years after World War II. This was less superheroes and more romance novels. The Silver Age was ended in 1970s. Characters were reinvented and thus created the multiverse. The Bronze Age was in the early 90s. This was during the Watergate period, so the stories were a little darker and the artwork became more realistic. The Copper Age is the modern age. It's today's comic books. Each age kind of reflects its own time period historically. I will then move on to discussing the things that every comic book collector should know. First off, every comic book collector needs to know terminology, organization, and know kind of what they want. Some common terms found in an article by Aaron Albert are panel, word balloon, splash page, and storage items such as bags and boards. A panel is a box in which a scene takes place. A word balloon is a bubble containing a character's dialogue. A splash page is a scene that fills the entire page. This is usually for a more dramatic scene, such as in Action Comics. Storage items include bags, boards, and boxes. A bag is a plastic bag that keeps elements from ruining the comic book condition. A board is an acid-free piece of cardboard that goes within the bag that keeps the comic from bending. And a box is simply a box that you store all your comics in. Boxes help with organization, which is extremely important if you plan on ever reselling your comics. One of the most important things to know, though, is what you want. Learning to know what you want can be very difficult, being that there's many different companies such as DC, Marvel, Dark Horse, and of course, many others. There are many characters and stories. There's superheroes, there's romance, there's things like The Walking Dead. And also knowing your price range is very important. If you're going to buy current comics, that can go from $1 to $15. Or you're going to buy deals, such as the 50-cent box at your local comic book stores, or go to Free Comic Book Day. Or are you a big spender who likes to buy old and rare comics? Whatever the case may be, options are endless, and so is the fun. Finally, I'm going to talk about how comic books are priced. Important aspects of pricing comic books are rarity, popularity, and the grade of comic book. Other things to keep in mind are if it's an original edition, a variant edition, or if it's a remake. For example, an original edition of the first Superman ever created can be worth up to $3.2 million in good condition. However, you can find a remake of the first edition Superman on eBay for $10. The most important thing about pricing comics is the grade of the comic. Grades range from 0.5 to 10, 10 being the best. Keeping a comic in mint condition can be very difficult. This is when knowing how to store a comic is very important. Storing a comic individually goes from bags and boards, and then your bulk storage is your boxes. The better grade a comic has, the higher it's worth. All these factors combined, rarity, popularity, the grade, everything goes into it, and that is how you determine how a comic is worth, how much a comic is worth. In closing, today I've talked about the history of comic books, things every comic book collector should know, and how to price a comic book. I highly recommend comic book collecting. I think it's awesome. It's super fun. Can be a little spendy sometimes. But if you keep the tips that I've said in mind, you'll succeed at it.